Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday of 6th week. It's a pretty dreary, cold day out there today. I hope you're bundled up somewhere nice and warm. A couple of announcements for the week. Make sure that you take a look at the essay for this week. And also remember that your reading summary is due today. So if you have any questions, reach out. Hopefully you're all making good progress on your videos. I haven't had a chance to look at your summaries yet, but I will get that done before the end of the week. So well done, everybody. Today, I thought that we would talk at least a little bit about the ecosystem services of plants in urban areas. And we've talked a lot about animals in the last couple of days and wildlife. And we talked a little bit about plants when we talked about landscape design and planning a little bit earlier in the quarter. But I want to spend a couple of days talking about using plants specifically in urban areas to alter the environment. And of course, while they're doing that, they're also being pretty, which is important, right? So if you think back about ecosystem services, you'll remember that there are 4 different types. So if you need to review those, you can go back to one of the first couple lectures there and take a look at those. But they are regulating, provisioning, cultural, and then supporting, right? So regulating would be changing the environment, which is sort of what we're going to talk about here. Cultural would be that sort of sense of place, or appreciating the fact that the plants are pretty. What's after that? Regulating, cultural. Provisioning would be providing food, right? And that actually happens quite a bit in urban environments. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about food. But then the last one, of course, was supporting. And that's why I have the photo here of the bees. And supporting is when ecosystem services support or promote one of the other ecosystem services. So in this case, pollination, right, would be supporting the provisional ecosystem services. So take a look at those if you need a quick refresher. I think there's a good video up on that as well. So the ecosystem services that plants provide change from city to city, right? And you can probably wrap your brain around this pretty easy. I took 2 cities that are very different from one another in climate and also things like tourism and, just sort of the function of the city itself. So I picked Moscow, Russia, which we probably would think of as being a very cold place. And then I also picked Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And you can think of that as being quite a warm place, right? So I want you to think about the plants in these 2 spaces, right? And think about how they would be different, but also how the services that they provide, what changes them, what makes them different in these 2 very different climates, right? And so some of the things that you have to remember about these 2 spaces and any 2 cities across the world, right? It could be Kalamazoo and San Diego for that matter, right? Think about differences in precipitation, right? Here in Michigan, we get plenty of water, right? Typically our urban trees aren't suffering too badly from drought. It's not always the case, but typically, Michigan cities get plenty of water. We get plenty of snow in the wintertime, which also helps with ground moisture. And us compared to a city like Phoenix, Arizona, right? Precipitation levels are very, very, very different, right? And not just precipitation, but also things like relative humidity and dew point and things like that, right? So our climates are very different from city to city. In addition to that, there are differences in growing seasons, right? In some places, trees have leaves all year round, right? So in Rio, we think of that as a very tropical place. Their trees don't lose their leaves, right? And so those cities have the ecosystem services that those plants provide year round, right? And it's not to say that the trees that we have here, I'm looking at a walnut tree out of my window here that has dropped all of its leaves. It's not that that tree fails to provide ecosystem services during the wintertime. It's just that those services change, right? And if we're talking about insulation or shading or thermal protection, that shifts according to the growing season. So those types of things that are important to remember. In addition to that, our wind movements, so pollutant concentrations. So how much wind comes through a city, how much air circulation do we have? Does that change seasonally? Does that change with the coming of the rainy season or the coming of the dry season? How are pollutants concentrated in cities because of their natural placement in geography, right? And typically cities that are located on the coast, right, would have great wind movement and constant wind movement. And so pollutants in those cities aren't nearly as concentrated as the ones in cities that are much more landlocked, right? So all of these things are very important when we think about how ecosystem services change from one city to the next. And I picked two cities that were globally opposite of one another, but this could also be the same for a cities just here in Michigan, right? So we could be talking about Traverse City that sits on the bay, right? It sits on the bay of Lake Michigan, good airflow, very insulated by the lake, compared to us here in Kalamazoo, who are quite far from the lake. And so the currents and things that are taking place in our atmosphere are not the same, right? So it doesn't have to be that the cities be like crazy different. These ecosystem services change from city to city. And there's Finn putting in his 2 cents. So now let's think about the plants. All right, let's think about the plants that grow in these two different types of spaces. And I mentioned already the changes in seasonality, right? And how the trees here in Moscow, most of them will lose their leaves in the wintertime, whereas of course, palm trees in Rio, they don't, right? So they continue to provide shade and some of that thermal insulation there that the trees here in Moscow would not have. So some other things to think about, okay, when we're talking about plants, and I almost always default back to trees, right? As a tree physiologist, that's the kind of plant that I'm often talking about, but it's not just trees, okay? We're also talking about shrubs. We're also talking about, other plants that are used to insulate spaces and provide, some of these services. So one thing to think about is urban biodiversity, and how would urban biodiversity be different from city to city, right? And some of this has to do with location, right? And how many types of plants will grow in a particular spot. And again, if you think about here in Michigan, the plants that grow in our cities, there are not near as many different kinds of plants that would grow here compared to somewhere more tropical, right? Doesn't make it bad, it just makes it different, right? So urban biodiversity would change from city to city. And again, it could be the difference between us and Grand Rapids, okay? Just difference in location, difference in city planning, difference in city development, different in city climate, right? One thing that's really important that we don't think about very often is how old the tree canopy is within a city. So if you think back to when we talked a little bit about Nashville, Tennessee, right? And how their urban heat island is very pronounced, right? And that urban heat island, part of the reason that it has spiked so much in the last couple of years is because they've lost a lot of their trees, their mature trees, right? And they've lost those to insects and disease, but also to some of the more intense storms that we're having as a result of climate change. So their tree canopy age now has been reduced because some of those trees have been replanted. But now think about the difference between a tree that's only, 2 or 3 inches in diameter compared to a full grown mature tree that's 30 or 40 trees or centimeters in diameter, right? So there's a huge difference in what type of ecosystem services you get in a city based on the age of your tree, okay, and also based on the canopy size of your trees, right? So a tree that's 77 centimeters DBH, okay, that's a pretty big tree. You can think about it, that being about 1 meter across, right? Not quite, but close. Will sequester 70 times the airborne pollutants that a tree that's 8 centimeters would sequester. And that's a real big difference, right? And when you multiply that across the urban canopy, you know, if you have a lot of mature trees, you're pulling out so many more pollutants than you would if your tree population in your city is very young and very small, right? So these ecosystem services change city to city, depending on kind of where they're at with their tree canopies. And that's why it's important to have age diversity as well as species diversity. That way you don't lose your whole canopy all at one time. Right? Okay. So we talked a little bit about plants and urban temperatures, and we talked about the physiological aspects of that and the fact that it's plant transpiration that often helps to cool green spaces within cities, right? And we talked about how just transpiration, not shade, right? But just transpiration can cool an area up to 9 degrees Fahrenheit, right? That's a pretty big difference. And so I thought that I would talk just briefly about that process because it's important to understand how this works, right? So this is a redwood tree. This is not typically a tree that you would find in urban areas, but it is the example of the tallest trees that we have worldwide, right? So very impressive trees, very, 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 very tall. And that's why I use it for this example, because it shows you how even a tree that's hundreds of meters tall can move water from its roots all the way out to the top of the canopy, right? So we call this, in plant biology, we call this the cohesion tension theory. And this is the most common theory about how water moves within trees. And it's very well established at this point. And so basically what's happening within any plant, all right, so not just trees, not just this particular tree, but any of the plants out there, when one molecule of water moves out of the stomata, right? Remember the stomata look kind of like this, and they're found up in the canopy of the tree. I'm gonna have to take that toy away. Give me a second, I'll be right back. Maybe he's gonna be quiet. I thought I could pause this. Sorry about that. I am back with the toy of choice here, the narwhal. So we'll just put that on the desk so that he can't get to it for a little while. All right, back to the cohesion tension theory. So you're moving water through the plant, and as one molecule of water comes out of the stomate and into the air, another water molecule moves to take its place. And it does that through the process and the, it's not really a process, it's a phenomenon, right, that we call cohesion. And if you've ever put your hands on top of a water surface, right, and you kind of move your hands back and forth and the water sticks to you, right, that's cohesion. Okay, so next time you're in a pool or in the bathtub, do that, and you can feel that the water is sticking to your hands. And so water sticks together, okay? And so through the column of the tree, up through the xylem, that water is sticking to each other and being pulled then through the plant. And so it's very similar to you using a straw, right? It's not exactly the same process, but it's very similar. Okay, so then one water molecule moves from the soil into the root, and that keeps that whole chain intact, right? Tension occurs within the plant, right? And it happens throughout the plant, keeping those water molecules all together, right? And so I'll post a video of this and how this works. And it's pretty impressive how these plants do this. So that's how water moves through plants. That's important in this discussion because transpiration does significantly alter our outdoor temperatures, right, in cities and also natural areas. So some of the things that we've talked about in this class is just me kind of showing you pictures and thinking about how that particular space is different from the others that we look at, right? So I want to do that here again, just very briefly, because I think you've seen these photos before. This is the highway moving into Chicago. And I want you to think through these next photos, what the differences are in land use and land cover, right? So I had a picture of the Ford assembly plant. I think I took that out, but we'll get back to that in a minute. Again, moving into downtown Chicago, what is land use here? It is human activity, specifically human movement, right, into and out of the city. And land cover here is mostly structural, right? It's mostly human made. There's a little bit of vegetation, right, that you can see here throughout, but not a whole lot, right? Same thing here. What is our land use? Human activity, human residential, right? Land cover, we have more vegetation now. However, our biodiversity is probably not very high, although it wasn't very high in the last photo either. But we do have more green space in this particular photo. And then, here we are back to our park. Again, human activity, but land cover is very different here. Much more diversity than we saw in either of the other two photos, and more trees, right? And more space that is covered by shade, kind of reaping the benefits of that transpiration that's occurring there. And so thinking about that land cover, okay, and how land cover changes from space to space, I want to talk a little bit about how that impacts urban energy, right? And again, most of this comes back to the urban heat island because we think of that energy as being emitted as heat, and most of the time it is, right? So one of the things that directly contributes this is what we would call absorptivity, right? And absorptivity is how much heat is absorbed in a space. Okay, so here we are back to our heat photos, right? But it shows you here how much heat is being absorbed by different elements within that particular space. So you have the car and the parking lot here, which both show up very, very hot, right? So they're absorbing a lot of heat. When you look off into the distance here, you can see that the trees and the ground cover are not absorbing nearly as much heat as those hardscapes are, right? So absorptivity is important. How much heat is being trapped and absorbed within, whatever element that you're looking at. Reflectivity is also important, and it's how much heat is reflected. And in this case, we would call this albedo, right? And you've heard that term in both ecology and environmental science, right? Albedo is sort of the measure of whiteness that something is, right? So when you think about surfaces in urban spaces, how white are they tells you how much heat could be reflected or how much heat could be absorbed, right? And so here's some examples of that. Roofing, colored paint, trees have a pretty low reflectivity. Asphalt, very, very, very dark. Concrete is also not very good at reflecting, right? Grass, ice, things like that. So albedo changes, and when albedo changes, that changes the absorptivity, right? Because heat that's reflected is not absorbed. Okay, that's important. Transmissivity is how much heat is transmitted through. Okay, and this is important, and this is sort of a weird one to kind of wrap your brain around. But I think this example does a pretty good job of explaining it. So think of transmissivity, right, as being how much heat or how much light is being transmitted through something. Okay, so in this case, these people, okay, are sitting under a tree. So the tree is providing some shade, but it's not providing all of the shade, right? Some light is coming through and some heat is coming through. It's not a total block. Some of it is being transmitted. Okay, so shade can reduce sunlight penetration somewhere around 20 to 30%. Shaded buildings, shaded from trees, can be up to 20 degrees cooler than buildings that are open to full sun. And shade can reduce heating and cooling costs up to 20 to 30%. So transmissivity is also very important. And again, I think the easiest way to think about that is to think about how much light is coming through something, right? And I think trees are probably the best way to explain that. And then fourth is the emissivity, okay? How much heat then, after it's been absorbed, is being emitted back into the environment. So a good example of this, right, is the black house here. The black house has very, absorbs a lot of heat. The albedo of this would be similar to black pavement, right? So it's absorbing a lot of heat. There are not a lot of trees around this house, so transmissivity is very high, right? 100% of the light is coming through. And so think about the difference between the emissivity of this house compared to the amount of heat that is being re-emitted from this raised garden, right? You are on pavement. It is dark pavement, but the plants and the boxes here are providing some shade. Much of the space that is underneath these plants, transmissivity isn't very high because they're absorbing the light out here. And so there's a big difference, right, between how much heat is being released back from plants compared to how much heat is being released from, in this case, a very, very dark human-made hardscape, right? So emissivity is also very important. And if you need another example of how this works, think about picking up a hot rock on a hot day, right? You pick it up and you can feel the heat coming off of it. Or when you're walking down the sidewalk or the road in the summer, and you can actually see the heat coming up, but you can definitely feel the difference in the heat coming up. So those are the four things that kind of contribute to the energy budget, right? Absorptivity, reflectivity, transmissivity, and then emissivity, right? So all the ivities there. And it's important to understand how those work and how that affects the atmosphere that we have out there in the world. So let's think again about our parking lot. Excuse me. What is the absorptivity here? High, right? What's the reflectivity? Low, although this is probably a better colored parking lot than many that I have seen, right? This is more, I would say, more on the lighter shade. So it is probably reflecting more light than you would see in a, a totally dark parking lot. So that's good, right? And these cars are also absorbing and reflecting heat, right? Black car here is absorbing a lot more heat than the white car that's next to it, okay? That car is reflecting more heat and light back. So a lot of things happening in this parking lot and not a shade tree to be seen, right? Not a single plant here to reduce transmissivity or to change emissivity. This is something that we've talked about as well. Vehicle emissions come in basically three different types. The first is exhaust, right? How much exhaust comes out of your tailpipe as you're driving down the road and as your vehicle is running. And remember that even if your car is just sitting there idling, it is burning fossil fuels. Okay, and it is, you are contributing greenhouse gases at that point, right? So make sure that you don't turn your car on until you're ready to go. That's one of the, it can save you up to 2 or 3 tanks of gas a year. If you wait, you get all your devices hooked up and you figure out where you're going on your phone and you get all settled in, put your seatbelt on, and when you're ready to go, that's when you start your car, right? Try to get in the habit of that. It can be pretty impactful. Okay. There's also abrasive emissions. So abrasive emissions occur. The easiest one to kind of wrap your brain around is your tires on the road, right? And the friction that those tires have as they're pulling you down the highway. So there are emissions that come from that, heat, and also the wear and tear on your tires. And lastly, and this is where we get back to the photo that we just came from, right? These are evaporative emissions. And your car just sitting there emits things, right? It emits more things in the daytime because of the sun energy that's coming in. It gives you more during that time than it does at night, right? Because absorptivity is higher, reflectivity is lower, right? And a lot of differences there between day and night. So you're losing things from your car and it's not doing anything, right? It's sitting there in a hot parking lot. Your gas is evaporating, your tires are degrading, all sorts of things are being evaporated from your car's systems, just sitting there, right? And so if you have all of these cars on this parking lot and they're all doing that, that adds up pretty quickly, okay? And so, how can we change this? How can we change the properties of a parking lot that's this big, that it's clearly used, right? The space is used and necessary. How do we change it, right? And one of the ways that we talked about is changing the pavement color, right? That's one very, very simple change. You could paint this parking lot white, right? Which would help us even more. And that's something that these graduate students did. They painted the parking lot different colors, and they are assessing how that will be, how that will change all those 4 properties of this particular pavement, right? So that's one thing that we can do. You can cover them, right? This is a picture from the new parking lot at Michigan State that is now covered with solar panels. Pretty cool project that they did there to try to reduce their carbon emissions. So they're not only gaining the energy from the solar area here, but they're also shading the vehicles underneath, which is important. But here's an even better way, right? And providing shade from plants in a parking lot is very, very impactful. And it is an important part of landscape design, especially in hotter areas than we have here in Kalamazoo. So when you put shade trees around parking lots or near parking lots, it reduces the temperature. It muffles noise, which is important. We've now talked a little bit about noise pollution. It reduces the glare. Okay, if you've ever walked across an open, really sunny parking lot, your eyes feel that burn, right? That's glare. And if you reduce glare, that can help local wildlife as well. I know a couple of you, if you don't live in Traverse City, you have been up in Traverse, and there are actual Department of Natural Resources warnings that come out every spring that talk about how loons actually perceive from the air, they perceive parking lots and roads as waterways. Okay. And so then they try to land on them and they become hurt, or they can't, they have a difficult time taking off after that. And so you have to call the DNR to come pick up the loon and transport it to a body of water so that it can kind of recover and figure out where it's going, right? But if you reduce glare, then you reduce some of that reflection that mimics water from up above. Now Pixie is crying. And in addition to that, if you add trees, you're reducing runoff, right? Because water is being trapped within the branches of those trees, and it's slowing down, right? And when we reduce runoff, we also reduce the temperature of the water that's running into wastewater management, which of course reduces the pollution of that water. So there are what we call standards in landscape design for putting trees in parking lots. So one of your assignments this week was not really an assignment, but one of the things I want you to pay attention to is when you're out and about, look at parking lots. How are they constructed? What color are they? Are there any trees around? How many trees are there? Where are they located? Some of them provide perimeter shade, right? Like this one. Some of them provide interior shade, and there are standards that tell you if you have a parking lot that is this size, then you need to have this many trees within that parking lot in order to shade the space. Okay? Species selection is extremely important in these cases because you have to, think about these trees here. Where are they growing? What are they growing in? What resources do they have available? Not much, right? It's hot where they are. They're in full blistering sun. They're getting heat that's re-emitted back up from the parking lot. They're getting all sorts of exhaust and things from the cars that are moving in and out. So it takes a very special tree to grow in that place, right? So proper planning and proper putting the right plant in the right place is important in this particular discussion. Right? And so one city that's doing a fabulous job with their parking lots is Sacramento, California. And all new construction parking lots must have 50% shade within 15 years of completion. And so that is a new policy that California or Sacramento as a city has established. And so if you want to build a parking lot, you have to follow the rules, right? And if you're going to follow the rules, you want to make sure you're doing the right thing because 15 years is a long time to wait. And if you have violated this particular policy, it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to fix it 15 years down the road, right? So you do it right the first time, you put those trees in, you wait your 15 years, and you hope for 50% cover there, right? So pretty cool that these kinds of standards exist and that there are cities that are working hard here with this. All right, I am going to leave off there for the day, and we will continue our discussion about plants in cities on Friday when we talk a little bit about plants and pollution. Sorry again for the dogs. This is, I don't know why they continue to do this when I'm talking to you guys, because it's always this class. They don't do this for my entomology class, but that's okay. We'll let them get on with it. So hope you have a great day today. I hope you're having a good week and that you're taking care of yourselves. Just a note, make sure that you vote. Okay, make a plan to vote, get out there and cast your ballot. All right, I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.